They buried the mud flood evidence, then claimed your cities were built in the 1800s. The basement windows hit me before the architecture did. I was standing outside a building in Philadelphia. A building the official records insist was constructed in 1847. And the windows of its ground floor, what we now call the ground floor, were partially buried. Not damaged. Not renovated over. Buried. As if the earth itself had risen around them. As if the building had sunk, slowly, into something wet and heavy and then forgotten. That's when I started pulling threads. Because once you see a half-buried window on a supposedly new building, you start seeing them everywhere. In Cincinnati. In Chicago. In cities across Central Asia and Western Europe. Buildings that should have been built clean, from foundation to cornice, sitting in the earth like they've been there 1,000 years longer than any deed or plaque suggests. What I found over the following months wasn't a clean answer. It was a pattern. And the pattern is unsettling in ways I'm still trying to fully understand. Let me start with what I found while researching something else entirely. I was looking into 19th century municipal development, the boring bureaucratic expansion of American cities after the Civil War. Census records. Building permits. Population movement. The kind of archival work that puts most people to sleep. But buried inside those records, in city ledgers sitting in the Philadelphia Municipal Archives, the Chicago History Museum Research Center, and the St. Louis Public Library Special Collections, was something that stopped me cold. The sheer volume of construction attributed to a 40-year window, roughly 1830 to 1870, simply doesn't match the documented labor capacity of those decades. I'm not talking about a rounding error. I'm talking about thousands of monumental structures, courthouses, train stations, hospitals, universities, asylums, post offices, all attributed to an era when per capita steel and concrete production was a fraction of what would have been required. When the documented workforce was busy fighting 2 major wars and managing catastrophic epidemics. The timeline isn't subtle. The official story goes like this. Following the Industrial Revolution, Western nations entered a period of unprecedented urban expansion. Advances in manufacturing, rail transport, and immigrant labor allowed cities to grow explosively between approximately 1820 and 1900. Architectural styles diversified rapidly. Skilled craftsmen from Europe brought sophisticated building traditions to the New World. Structures that appear ancient were simply built with exceptional care using period-accurate materials. The grandeur we associate with 19th century civic architecture reflects the ambition of the era, not any mystery about its origins. This is the mainstream explanation. And to be fair to the official narrative, it's not entirely wrong. Construction did boom. Immigration did bring skilled labor. Cities did expand rapidly. But let me show you what the numbers actually suggest. Let's start with the numbers. The United States Census of 1840 recorded approximately 17 million people. Of those, an estimated 8 to 9% were engaged in construction-related trades, based on occupational surveys preserved at the National Archives in Washington. That gives you somewhere around 1.4 million workers, spread across a continent. Many of them engaged in basic residential construction, road building, and agricultural infrastructure. Now consider what we're being asked to believe was built during this period. In Cincinnati alone, the period between 1845 and 1875 allegedly produced the Cincinnati Music Hall, an enormous Gothic Revival structure with vaulted ceilings, hand-carved stonework, and foundational engineering that modern architects have called bewilderingly advanced for its era. The building still stands. It is genuinely magnificent. The music hall sits, partially, below current street level. Speaking of Cincinnati, there's a detail that most histories casually skip over. During construction of the music hall in 1878, workers excavating the foundation encountered what local newspapers at the time, the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, specifically its July 14, 1878 edition, described as an enormous layer of thick, consolidated sediment, beneath which they found structural remnants that could not be dated to any known prior construction project. The official explanation, offered later, was that these were the remains of a prehistoric burial mound. This explanation was accepted, and the matter was closed. Mound. Sealed under a music hall. In a sediment layer that no geologist was formally asked to date. That's not archaeology. That's a filing cabinet that nobody opened. Which brings me to the sediment itself. There is a category of geological event that most people have never heard of, not because it's obscure, but because the discussion of it in mainstream academic literature is remarkably sparse given its potential scale. The event goes by several names in fringe scholarship, but the general concept is this: a rapid, continent-spanning deposition of alluvial material, consistent with either a catastrophic flood, a series of impact events, or some combination of atmospheric and geological forces occurring sometime in the relatively recent past, recent meaning within the last 2 to 3 centuries. I want to be careful here. I'm not a geologist. I'm a researcher who reads documents. And the documents I've read, including USGS quaternary geology surveys, sediment core analyses published in peer-reviewed journals and available through the Geological Society of America, and several unpublished regional studies sitting in university basements, suggest something that the mainstream timeline struggles to accommodate. The sediment layers beneath dozens of major American and European cities show a distinct stratigraphy. Below a certain depth, a depth that in many locations aligns almost perfectly with current basement or sub-basement floors of 19th century structures, there is a layer of consolidated silta material, sometimes reaching several meters in thickness, that does not match the geological history of the region above or below it. In other words, something deposited a lot of material, quickly, across a very wide area. And then someone built cities on top of it. Let me be fair to the official narrative here, because there are straightforward explanations for some of this. Cities do experience grade changes over time. Streets get raised. Sediment accumulates. New layers of material are added through ordinary municipal maintenance. The famous Chicago street raising of the 1850s and 1860s is a documented historical event, in which the city literally jacked up buildings and raised entire blocks by up to 12 feet. This is real. It is well documented. It explains some of the buried window phenomenon in Chicago specifically. But here's what matters. The Chicago street raising was documented precisely because it was extraordinary. It was an engineering spectacle. People wrote about it. Photographs were taken. The Chicago Tribune covered it obsessively. Engineers left detailed records. So why, across dozens of other cities, in Europe and Asia and South America, where no such municipal engineering project is documented, do we find the same pattern? The same partially buried ground floors. The same windows that start 2 or 3 feet below what is now ground level. The timing is almost theatrical. In 2016, a researcher named David Ewing Duncan published an examination of European urban archaeological surveys, not a conspiracy document, but a sober analysis in an architectural history context, noting that a statistically unusual number of pre-19th century structures across Central Europe showed evidence of what he called rapid environmental burial, meaning the lower portions of exterior walls had been encased in alluvial material without the evidence of gradual accumulation you'd expect from centuries of slow deposition. The paper, originally prepared for a conference on urban archaeology hosted by the University of Vienna, noted that this pattern was consistent across sites in Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and parts of Germany. It noted the anomaly. It suggested further study. And then, as far as I can determine, nothing happened. The paper was not widely cited. No follow-up studies appeared in major journals. I spent 3 weeks trying to find the conference proceedings. They exist. They are held at the University of Vienna Library. They are not digitized. Sealed, effectively, in a reading room in Austria. Speaking of what isn't digitized, there's a pattern in what survives from official archives and what doesn't. The 1890 United States Census records were famously destroyed in a 1921 fire at the Commerce Department building in Washington. Most people know this. What fewer people know is that the fire was localized almost entirely to the storage area containing decennial census records from 1880 through 1890, precisely the decades corresponding to the tail end of the great municipal construction boom. Other records in the same building survived: personnel files, department correspondence, budget documents. The census records, containing occupational and property data that would allow researchers to verify exactly who built what and where, were reduced to ash. Fire. In the exact storage room, containing exactly the records you need. Maybe that's coincidence. Most archivists will tell you it is. Fire was a constant hazard in early 20th century government buildings. The census records were stored in wooden cases. The sprinkler systems were inadequate. Maybe. But here's where it gets harder to dismiss. Because the pattern of missing or destroyed records isn't limited to one fire in Washington. The Smithsonian Institution, founded, officially, in 1846, with a charter explicitly including the documentation of American archaeological history, has been the subject of ongoing controversy regarding what happened to thousands of artifacts recovered during the great infrastructure projects of the 19th century. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the digging of the Erie Canal, the excavation of urban foundations across the expanding frontier. Reports from field surveyors employed by the Army Corps of Engineers between 1850 and 1890, reports that were regularly forwarded to the Smithsonian for cataloging, describe, in several cases, the recovery of artifacts and structural remnants that could not be placed within the known indigenous or colonial archaeological record. These reports exist. Many of them are available through the National Anthropological Archives, which the Smithsonian maintains in Suitland, Maryland, in a facility that is not open to walk-in researchers and requires formal academic credentialing to access. What those reports describe in their most anomalous cases is this: evidence of advanced material construction, in some instances, brick and tile and glazed ceramic, in sediment layers that, based on surrounding geological context, should have been deposited prior to any known civilization in the region. I don't have answers here. I want to be clear about that. What I have are the reports, and the absence of any mainstream explanation for what was found in them, and a facility that sits in suburban Maryland with its contents catalogued but largely unexamined. Now let me show you the piece that genuinely keeps me up at night. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, better known as the Chicago World's Fair, produced a collection of buildings so architecturally sophisticated that contemporary architects and engineers have repeatedly described them as ahead of their time. The White City, as it was called, featured enormous neoclassical structures with precise column work, advanced electrical systems, and construction quality that drew comparisons to ancient Rome. These buildings were built, the official record tells us, in roughly 2 years. 1891 to 1893. On former marshland. By workers using period technology. And then, and this is the part that the official narrative glosses over without adequate explanation, virtually all of them were demolished. Within 2 years of the fair's conclusion, the majority of the White City structures were gone. Some burned. Some were torn down. The Jackson Park site was cleared with remarkable speed and thoroughness. The official explanation is that the structures were always intended to be temporary, built from a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber, rather than permanent stone. This is true. It is documented. The staff construction is verifiable. But here's what nobody explains adequately. Multiple contemporary photographs, surviving in the Chicago History Museum's collection and viewable on their digital archive, show foundations and substructures for these supposedly temporary buildings that are clearly not made of staff. They are masonry. Heavy, thick, load-bearing masonry that is not remotely consistent with 2-year temporary construction. Someone built a foundation under those buildings that they intended to last. And then someone else tore it all down. Let me pull these threads together, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is a collection of anomalies. Strange sediment. Missing records. A suspicious fire. Some unusually deep foundations. None of it adds up to anything definitive. You're right that I don't have something definitive. I want to be honest about that. But let me show you the pattern as I see it, and then you can decide what you think. Consider the following sequence. Sometime in the relatively recent past, the evidence is consistent with a range between the early 17th and late 18th centuries. A significant environmental event deposited material across large portions of the northern hemisphere. This event, whatever it was, left behind a stratum of consolidated sediment that partially buried existing structures. When populations recovered or arrived at these sites, or when the controlling historical narrative was being constructed, the buried structures were incorporated into the new urban fabric. Ground floors became basements. Partial windows became architectural curiosities. The sediment layer became simply the ground. The massive institutional construction attributed to the mid-19th century may, in at least some cases, represent not new construction but the cleaning, rehabilitation, and reattribution of existing structures. Structures whose true provenance was either unknown, inconvenient. The archived gaps, the fires, the inaccessible collections, the uncatalogued field reports, are consistent with a deliberate or semi-deliberate effort to prevent researchers from assembling a complete picture. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But consider, if a prior civilization had existed at significant scale across the northern hemisphere, and had been largely erased by a catastrophic event, what would the evidence look like? It would look like anomalous sediment. It would look like buildings whose construction dates are contested by their own architectural evidence. It would look like a network of institutional archives that are technically accessible but practically closed. It would look like records that were destroyed in fires, or stored in facilities that require academic credentials to enter, or digitized selectively, or simply never transferred from the paper ledgers in which they were originally recorded. It would look exactly like what we have. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There's a woman I correspond with, a retired municipal archivist from a mid-sized Midwestern city, who spent 30 years managing the records of her city's building and zoning department. She told me something when I asked her about discrepancies in early construction permits. She said that in her experience, the oldest buildings in most American cities have permit records that fall into one of two categories. Either they are meticulously documented, with original survey drawings, contractor agreements, and material invoices going back to the first day of construction. Or they have nothing. No permits. No surveys. No contractor records. Just a date stamped on a deed, and the building standing there as if it had always been there. She said in her experience this second category was more common than most people realize. And that when she had inquired, early in her career, why so many significant structures had no construction documentation at all, she was told that early city governments didn't keep thorough records. She accepted that for 20 years. Then she started looking at what else those same early city governments had documented with obsessive thoroughness. Tax records, land transfers, business licenses, birth and death registrations. They documented everything, except the construction of their most impressive buildings. The evidence still exists. That's what I keep coming back to. The sediment cores are still in geology labs. The field reports are still in boxes in Suitland, Maryland. The photographs from the Chicago World's Fair are still in the museum's digital collection. The permit ledgers with their conspicuous gaps are still sitting in municipal archives across the country, available to anyone with a research card and enough patience to file a records request. Nothing has been permanently erased. Not yet. What's happened instead is something more elegant, and, in some ways, more troubling. The evidence has been contextualized. Explained into harmlessness. Each anomaly given its own tidy official interpretation, so that no one ever has to look at all of them together and ask what the aggregate pattern suggests. Half-buried windows? Grade changes over time. Anomalous sediment? Normal alluvial deposition. Missing construction records? Poor early bureaucratic practices. Suspicious archive fires? Standard hazards of the era. Foundations too substantial for temporary buildings? Overbuilding by enthusiastic contractors? Each explanation, individually, is plausible. Together, deployed against a pattern this consistent, across this many cities, across multiple continents, they start to feel less like explanations and more like a script. I don't have answers. I never claimed to. What I have is a pattern that I cannot stop seeing, and a growing conviction that the story we've been told about when our cities were built, and by whom, and on top of what, deserves considerably more scrutiny than it has received. The mud is still there, under your feet. It's been there for a very long time. And the question of what it buried, and why no one seems particularly eager to find out, is one I keep returning to, late at night, when the answers refuse to come.